3 days before I was supposed to sign over my medical practice, my former scrub nurse pulled me into a supply closet and pressed her finger to her lips. I had no idea what was happening. I'd stopped by Mercy Glen Family Clinic, the practice I'd built from nothing over 22 years, to pick up the last of my personal files before the transition. Dr. Patricia Okafor, my nurse of 14 years, had met me at the side entrance with her eyes wide and her hands trembling. "Don't say a word," she whispered. "Just listen." She guided me past the medication cabinet, past the old supply shelves, and pressed her back against the wall beside the air vent. The vent connected to the conference room next door. I'd had it installed myself in 2009 when I remodeled the clinic. I knew exactly how sound traveled through it. I held my breath. I'm so glad you're watching. Before we go on, drop a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from today. These stories travel further than I ever expect, and it means everything to know you're here. And just so you know, some details in this story have been changed or dramatized for storytelling purposes. Any resemblance to real names or places is coincidental. But the message? That part is entirely real. My name is Margaret Lawson. I'm 63 years old. I spent 4 decades as a family physician in Clover Ridge, Tennessee, a small city that felt like a real town even as it grew. I delivered babies, diagnosed cancers early enough to save lives, held the hands of patients who had no one else in their final hours. When my husband Gerald died of a stroke in 2014, I did what I always did. I kept working. The clinic was my anchor. It was the thing that kept me standing when everything else had been taken away. The voice coming through that vent was low and careful. A man's voice, smooth, controlled. "The asset transfer documents are ready. She signs Thursday. By Friday, Ashford Medical Group takes operational control. We move the Clover Ridge patient files to their system over the weekend." I went cold. A second voice, younger, hesitant. "My son Daniel. And she won't know until after? She'll think she's signing a retirement transition agreement." Standard language. We buried the full transfer clause in the exhibit on page 11. That was Nathan Griggs, my estate attorney. The man I had trusted for 9 years. The man who had drafted Gerald's will. The man who had been at my husband's funeral. Daniel again. What about the valuation? She thinks it's a gift to the community. She thinks it's selling for $2.8 million. The actual sale price is $4.1. The difference goes into the holding account. And my cut? A pause. As agreed. $350,000. Wired the same day she signs. Patricia's hand found mine in the dark. I bit the inside of my cheek hard enough to taste metal. My son. My only child. The boy I had raised alone after Gerald died. The boy I had put through Vanderbilt on the money I made from this clinic. He was selling me and my life's work for $350,000. I am so grateful you stayed with me through that moment, because what I felt standing in that supply closet, I wouldn't wish on anyone. Before we go further, tell me in the comments, have you ever had someone close to you show you who they really were, all at once, in a single moment? I read every single one. The voices continued for a few more minutes. Something about the patient records, something about the parking lot lease, and then chairs scraped and footsteps moved toward the hallway door. A door opened and closed. Silence. Patricia turned on the light above the shelving unit. Her eyes were wet. "They were here 2 weeks ago," she said quietly. "Same conversation. I didn't know if I should. I kept thinking maybe I misunderstood." "You understood perfectly." My voice came out steady. "I don't know how. Dr. Lawson, what are you going to do?" I looked at her. This woman had worked beside me for 14 years. She had stayed through the lean years, through the pandemic, through the months after Gerald died when I could barely function. She had just risked her job, maybe more, to make sure I knew the truth. "I need to get to my car," I said. "Can you get me out the side entrance without running into anyone?" She nodded and led me out. I sat in my car in the Mercy Glen parking lot for a long time. The folder of personal files sat on the passenger seat. My clinic key, the original brass key from when I'd first opened the doors in 2002, was still on my keychain. Thursday was 3 days away. I need to tell you something about my son before I go further, because none of what happened makes sense without it. Daniel was a good child. Quiet, careful, serious. He graduated with honors from Vanderbilt and came home to Clover Ridge the summer Gerald was diagnosed. He stayed longer than he planned. Gerald died faster than anyone expected, a massive hemorrhagic stroke, June 10, 2014. Daniel was 29. He stood at Gerald's grave beside me, and I held his hand and I said, "We'll get through this together." He stayed for 6 months. Then he went back to Nashville. He took a position at a financial consulting firm, came home for holidays, called most Sundays. In 2019, he moved back. He said he wanted to be closer, said he was tired of the city. I was thrilled. I gave him the guest cottage on the property and introduced him to everyone. Then he met Nathan Griggs. They met at a Chamber of Commerce dinner I'd brought Daniel to. Nathan was charming, well-dressed, knew everyone in the room. Within a month, they were having lunch twice a week. Within 6 months, Nathan had suggested that Daniel get more involved in my long-term planning. The suggestions started slowly. "Mom, have you thought about what happens to the clinic when you retire? Nathan thinks you should start the transition while you still have leverage. Mom, the market for independent practices is shrinking. You don't want to wait too long." I had heard similar things from well-meaning colleagues. I didn't think much of it. I was 63, not ancient. But Daniel kept pressing. Then, in the fall of last year, I forgot a patient's name midway through a consultation. I'd been awake for 19 hours. It meant nothing. But Daniel was in the waiting room that day. He'd offered to drive me when my car was in the shop, and one of the front desk staff mentioned it to him. By dinner, he was asking me if I'd been sleeping enough, if the practice was getting to be too much. Nathan began attending our planning meetings. He suggested an independent neurological evaluation, just to have a baseline, he said, for insurance purposes, for the transition documents. I agreed. I didn't see what was forming around me. Looking back, I can trace every step, the appointment scheduling errors Nathan attributed to me, but which later turned out to be made by a billing coordinator he had encouraged me to hire. There were 2 patient complaints in Q4 that reached the Tennessee Medical Board, both from patients I had never actually treated, names I didn't recognize. The board launched a review. My malpractice premiums spiked. 2 of my associate physicians quietly left for larger group practices. The clinic's revenue dropped 18% in 8 months. Nathan told me the timing was terrible for a sale. He was right. He had made sure of it. I drove home from Mercy Glen with all of this replaying in my mind. The house felt enormous and quiet. Gerald's study was still the same as the day he died, books on the shelves, his reading chair by the window. I sat there a lot when I needed to think. I needed to think now. I pulled out my phone and opened a private browser. Power of attorney fraud, Tennessee. Medical practice asset transfer fraud. Elder financial exploitation attorney. The results made my stomach drop. What Nathan and Daniel were planning had a name. It had legal precedence. It happened to people exactly like me, accomplished, independent, trusting women who didn't see it coming until the documents were already in front of them. I had 3 days. My phone buzzed. A text from an old colleague. Dr. James Whitfield, retired orthopedic surgeon, had been my neighbor on Sycamore Lane for 20 years. He had retired 2 years ago after a minor cardiac event. He texted occasionally, checking in. This time the text said something different. "Margaret, call me when you can. Saw something at the county clerk's office today that concerns me. Something with your clinic's deed." I called him from the driveway. He answered on the first ring. "I was filing some property paperwork," he said. "I noticed a deed amendment for Mercy Glen. Filed 4 weeks ago. It lists an LLC as co-owner. Something called Ridgeline Medical Holdings." I had never heard of Ridgeline Medical Holdings. "Jim," I said, "can you meet me tonight?" He was at my door within the hour. I told him everything. He listened without interrupting, the way good doctors do. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You need Marcus Webb," he said. I knew the name. Marcus Webb was a healthcare attorney in Nashville. He had a reputation for going after medical fraud cases that other firms found too complicated. "He'll still be in his office," Jim said. "I know him from the hospital board. Let me call." Marcus Webb met us at his Nashville office at 8 that evening. He was 58, deliberate, the kind of man who doesn't react visibly to anything you tell him. He read the description of the asset transfer documents. Nathan had prepared the version I had been given to review. which I'd photographed on my phone during a meeting 2 months ago without understanding why I felt uneasy. He zoomed in on page 11. He looked up. This isn't a retirement agreement. This is a full asset conveyance with a concealed price differential clause. If you sign this, you lose the clinic, the patient records database, the building lease, the equipment, everything, for a reported $2.8 million. The actual transaction is for $4.1. The difference, $1.3 million, goes into an LLC that has 2 members. Ridgeline Medical Holdings, I said. Nathan Griggs and Daniel Lawson, Marcus confirmed. He turned his computer screen toward me. The LLC registration was public record, filed 9 months ago. My son had been planning this for at least 9 months. I closed my eyes for a moment. Can we stop it? I asked. Yes. Emergency injunction to freeze the transaction, independent valuation, evidence of fraud, and we need to document the medical board complaints as part of a coordinated effort to depress your practice value. But I need more than what you have. I need a financial investigator. He slid a card across the desk. Helen Marsh, forensic accountant, former IRS Criminal Investigation Division, based in Memphis. Jim drove me home at midnight. Neither of us spoke much on the way. When he dropped me off, he said, "Gerald always said you were the toughest person he knew. He wasn't wrong." I didn't sleep. I lay on top of the covers and stared at the ceiling until 4 a.m, then got up, made coffee, and called Helen Marsh. She picked up on the second ring. She was in Clover Ridge by 2 the next afternoon. 60 years old, silver-haired, unhurried, with the kind of eyes that had seen too much dishonesty to be surprised by anything. We sat at my kitchen table with every document I had. She listened for 90 minutes without writing a single thing down. Then she opened her laptop. "Give me 48 hours, she said. "I have 60, I told her. "Thursday is the signing." She nodded once. "I only need 48. She worked from my dining room table. I brought her coffee and stayed out of her way. At 2 a.m, she knocked on the study door. I found the holding account. She turned her laptop toward me. Ridgeline Medical Holdings, a Delaware LLC, 2 members. Nathan Griggs, 51%. Daniel Lawson, 49%. Formed 11 months ago. First transaction. A retainer payment to a medical billing consultant named Sheila Brooks, who had been hired on Nathan's recommendation to manage my clinic's accounts in Q3 of last year. Sheila Brooks had generated the billing errors that had triggered the medical board review. Helen laid a printed spreadsheet on the table. Over 14 months, there were 11 discrete actions taken to depress the value of your practice. Staffing disruptions, manufactured compliance issues, patient record discrepancies, and 2 anonymous complaints to the medical board, both filed from the same IP address registered to a commercial mail service in Nashville. Nathan's office was in Nashville. The actual market value of Mercy Glen Family Clinic, Helen said quietly, is $4.9 million, not 4.1, and certainly not 2.8. I stared at the number. 22 years, $4.9 million. And they had been planning to hand me 2.8 and keep 2.1 for themselves, with my son's share going to cover what I later learned were significant gambling debts and a failed real estate investment in Chattanooga. There was more. Helen opened a second folder. Nathan Griggs has done this before. She laid out 2 case summaries. The first was a retired physician in Knoxville, 2019. Dr. Evelyn Stroop, 71 years old. Her nephews hired Nathan to manage a practice transition. The practice was sold under market value. The difference routed through a holding LLC. Dr. Stroop discovered the discrepancy 2 years later. By then, the statute of limitations on civil recovery had nearly run. She recovered 60 cents on the dollar after 3 years of litigation. The second was a retired dentist in Memphis, 2021. Dr. Howard Page, 68. Same structure, holding LLC. Suppressed valuation. Howard had signed the documents before anyone caught it. He never recovered the difference. There was a third name, Claudia Renner, 65, a retired veterinary clinic owner in Murfreesboro. 2022, Nathan had attempted the same scheme. Claudia's daughter, an accountant, had caught the discrepancy in the valuation and refused to let her mother sign. The case settled quietly. Nathan had never been charged. Claudia Renner was still alive, and according to Helen, she was willing to talk. I sat back in my chair. 3 people, 3 practices, 2 of them gone forever. I was meant to be the 4th. I looked at the window. The oak Gerald and I had planted the year we moved into this house was black against the night sky. I need all of this ready by Wednesday evening, I said. It'll be ready, Helen told me. The question is what you plan to do with it. I had been thinking about that since the supply closet. Nathan had scheduled the signing for Thursday at 10 in the morning at his office with a notary present. A clean, professional transaction. Witnesses. Legal formality. I was supposed to arrive and sign 4 documents, shake hands, and walk away believing I had gracefully retired. I called Marcus Webb at 8 the next morning. I don't want to stop it privately, I said. I want them to sit down at that table believing everything is going according to plan, and then I want them to understand exactly what they've done. Marcus was quiet for a moment. That's a significant choice. Nathan has done this twice before. If I handle it quietly, he walks away. He finds the next retired physician who trusts him. Another pause. All right. Here's how we do it. Jim Whitfield drove to Memphis to meet Claudia Renner in person. She was soft-spoken and careful, but clear. She would appear by video link. She had saved every document, every email, every communication from Nathan Griggs dating back to 2022. Patricia Okafor provided a signed statement documenting what she had overheard in the conference room on 2 separate occasions. Helen prepared a forensic report. 14 months of deliberate practiced evaluation, totaling approximately $900,000 in suppressed revenue and manufactured liability. Marcus filed the emergency injunction Wednesday evening, sealed until Thursday morning. Judge Patricia Holloway, Tennessee Chancery Court, approved it at 11 p.m. I didn't sleep Wednesday night either. I sat in Gerald's reading chair and talked to him the way I always do when things are very bad. I don't want to do this to Daniel, I said out loud. The room was dark and the oak tree moved in the window, but I don't know how to stop Nathan without going through our son. There was no answer, just the wind. At 7 Thursday morning, my phone buzzed. A text from Daniel. Morning, Mom. See you at 10. I sent back a simple reply. I'll be there. I wore Gerald's favorite color. A deep green jacket, the one he always said, made me look like someone who had things decided. I drove to Nathan's office alone. They were both already there when I arrived. Nathan stood when I came in, hand extended, warm smile. Daniel was at the conference table, a cup of coffee in front of him. He looked up and smiled. My son's face. 22 years ago, I had held him in my arms in the delivery room of this same county. Good morning, Margaret, Nathan said. Ready to make it official? Almost, I said. I set my purse on the table and sat down. I'd like to go over a few things first. Nathan's smile stayed perfectly steady. Of course. We have all morning. Good. I folded my hands on the table. I'd like to start with page 11. The smile didn't move, but something shifted behind his eyes. Specifically, I said, Exhibit C, Section 4, Subsection 2. The full asset conveyance clause with the price differential provision routing $1.3 million to Ridgeline Medical Holdings, LLC. Daniel set down his coffee cup. I'd also like to discuss the 11 documented actions taken over 14 months to suppress the market value of my practice from $4.9 million to $2.8. I opened my folder and slid 2 copies across the table. Helen Marsh prepared this. She was IRS criminal investigation for 20 years. I think you'll find it thorough. Nathan stood up. Margaret, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Please sit down, Nathan. He didn't sit. He picked up his phone. You can make that call, I said. But Marcus Webb filed an emergency injunction last night at 11. All accounts associated with Ridgeline Medical Holdings are frozen as of this morning. Ashford Medical Group has been notified that the transaction is under fraud review. Their legal team withdrew their execution authorization an hour ago. Nathan's phone hand lowered slowly. I turned to my son. Daniel was staring at the table. He hadn't spoken. His hands were flat on the surface in front of him, very still, the way they used to be when he was a child, and he'd done something he knew was wrong and was waiting for me to say something. Daniel. He looked up. His eyes were red. I need you to understand what you were part of, not the money. I want you to understand the pattern. I turned my laptop toward him. Claudia Renner appeared on the screen, live from Memphis. She was calm. She introduced herself. She described exactly what Nathan Griggs had done to her in 2022. The manufactured compliance issues, the suppressed valuation, the holding LLC, the pressure to sign quickly, before she had time to review properly. Daniel watched without moving. Then I showed him the case summaries. Dr. Evelyn Stroop, Dr. Howard Page, two physicians who had worked their entire lives to build something and had been left with half of what they'd earned, or less. Nathan has done this 3 times before you got involved, I said. 2 of those people lost everything they couldn't recover. You were going to help him do it to me. Daniel put his face in his hands. Nathan tried to speak twice. Marcus, on speakerphone, interrupted him both times with the specific statutes applicable to each charge. At 10:47, 2 Tennessee Bureau of Investigation agents, who had been briefed by Marcus the previous evening, arrived at the office. Nathan Griggs was placed under arrest for fraudulent conveyance, breach of fiduciary duty, conspiracy to commit financial elder abuse, and wire fraud. He was handcuffed in his own conference room, in his own office, with the unsigned documents still on the table in front of him. He looked at me once as they walked him out. He didn't say anything. I didn't look away. Daniel was not arrested. He was not charged. The prosecutors determined he had been a secondary participant, manipulated by someone with a sophisticated, established pattern of fraud. He had not known about the previous victims. He had not initiated the scheme. But he had known enough. He had been willing. He sat at that conference table for a long time after Nathan left. I sat across from him. Helen and Marcus gave us the room. Why? I finally said. He was quiet for a long time. I was in debt, he said. The Chattanooga investment. I'd put in $400,000. I borrowed against it. When it collapsed, I was down $600. I couldn't tell you. Why not? He looked up. Because you would have fixed it. You always fix everything, and I couldn't stand the thought of you looking at me that way, like I was someone who needed to be rescued again. I sat with that. Nathan said it was a clean transaction. He said you'd get fair value, just restructured. He said you were going to retire anyway. His voice broke slightly. He made it sound like I was helping you. And the $1.3 million difference? He looked at the table. He said it was a consulting fee. Standard for complex healthcare transitions. Did you believe that? A long pause. I wanted to, he said. I knew that answer. I had heard it before. Not from Daniel, from myself, about different things, in different years. Did you ever think about telling me? I asked. He was quiet for a moment. In September, he said. I almost called you. I got as far as dialing and then I hung up. Nathan had told me that if you found out before the signing, you'd never trust me again anyway. He said the only way out was through. Nathan told you that to keep you locked in. He nodded slowly. He knew that now. He had probably known it then. I stood up and walked to the window. Nathan's office looked out over a small parking lot with 3 oak trees along the perimeter. Similar to Gerald's. Similar to mine. Your father would have known what to say right now, I said. I don't. Daniel didn't say anything. I'm not going to tell you it's all right, I said. It isn't. You were going to let a man walk me out of the practice I built for 22 years with my name on a document I didn't fully understand, and you were going to take your cut and say nothing. I turned back to him. That is not all right. He nodded. But I also know that Nathan Griggs is very good at finding the places where people are afraid and building on them, and I know you were afraid. He put his head down. I'm your mother, I said. I'm not going anywhere, but this is going to take time. He didn't look up for a long while. When he did, his eyes were wet. I'm sorry, Mom. I know, I said. Prove it. The months that followed were quiet in the way that recovery is quiet, not peaceful, exactly, but settling. Nathan Griggs went to trial in the spring. He was convicted on 6 counts: fraudulent conveyance, breach of fiduciary duty, wire fraud, conspiracy to commit elder financial abuse, and 2 counts of securities fraud related to the Ridgeline LLC structure. He was sentenced to 9 years in state prison and ordered to pay restitution to Dr. Evelyn Stroop and the estate of Dr. Howard Page. Claudia Renner's civil case, which had been settled quietly in 2022, was reopened. Nathan filed for bankruptcy protection within 48 days of sentencing. His Tennessee bar license was permanently revoked. The Tennessee Medical Board reviewed the 2 anonymous complaints filed against my practice and dismissed both. The IP address tracing was submitted as part of the fraud investigation. The billing coordinator, Nathan, had recommended the one who had generated the errors resigned before she could be terminated. She was not charged, but she was named in the civil filing. Mercy Glen Family Clinic did not sell. I withdrew the transition agreement entirely. I hired a new practice manager, a woman named Rosalind Carter, who had run a multi-physician group practice in Nashville for 12 years. I brought on 2 associate physicians, both under 40, both committed to staying in Clover Ridge. By the following fall, patient volume was back to where it had been 2 years prior. Revenue recovered to $4.2 million on an annualized basis. Jim Whitfield joined the clinic's advisory board. He said he'd been bored in retirement anyway. Patricia Okafor received a formal commendation from my practice board and a raise she had been due for 3 years that I had somehow not gotten around to authorizing. I told her if she hadn't come to get me that morning, none of it would have been different. She said she had almost talked herself out of it twice on the drive to the clinic. She said she kept thinking about a conversation Gerald and I had once had in the break room years ago when I had stayed late after a hard patient loss. She said Gerald had told her she couldn't remember exactly when that I would never give up on anyone who came through my door, and he'd never understood why people assumed that didn't apply to me too. I had to excuse myself from that conversation for a few minutes. Daniel moved out of the guest cottage in July. He took an apartment in Knoxville, enrolled in a financial counseling program, and began working with a bankruptcy attorney to address his debts honestly. He called every Sunday. He didn't ask for forgiveness directly. He just kept showing up, week after week, in small ways: texts in the morning, a box of books he thought I'd like, a voicemail on my birthday that he left without knowing what to say and then said it anyway. In October, he drove to Clover Ridge for Gerald's birthday. We visit the grave every year. We always have. We stood under the oak tree in the cemetery. Gerald planted one here too, the year we were married, though he always claimed it was already there, and I held a small bunch of the yellow flowers Gerald loved. I keep thinking about what he would say, Daniel said quietly. So do I. I think he'd be angry with me. I considered that. Maybe, I said. But your father was angrier at himself than anyone else most of his life. He would have understood being in a corner and making a wrong choice. He wouldn't have excused it, but he would have understood it. Daniel was quiet. He would have told you to make it right, I said. Not to me. To yourself. We stood there a while longer. The wind moved through the oak tree. Tennessee October, everything going gold. I looked at Gerald's photograph on the headstone, the same one from our 25th anniversary, the year we took the trip to the Smoky Mountains, the year Daniel was 12 and still small enough to fall asleep on the drive home. I kept my promise, I thought. I protected what we built, but I'm trying to get better at the other part. The showing up, the putting down the chart and picking up the phone, the saying I love you out loud on ordinary days without waiting for a reason. Before we close, I want to say something to anyone watching who recognizes any part of this. If you are a woman who has spent your life building something, a practice, a business, a family, and someone is telling you that you're slipping, that it's time to step back, that you need protection, please talk to someone you trust before you sign anything. Please have an independent attorney review every document. Please do not mistake urgency for necessity. The people who love you will wait for you to understand what you're agreeing to. The people who don't will pressure you to sign quickly and ask questions later. And if you have a child or a niece or nephew or anyone you love who has made a serious mistake in a moment of fear, I'm not going to tell you what to do. That is yours to carry and decide. I can only tell you what I believe, which is this. Fear is not the same as cruelty. It doesn't excuse it, but it does explain it. And sometimes, if you're careful and honest with each other, explanation is the beginning of something. My son called last Sunday. We talked for an hour. He is doing better. I am doing better. We are not the same as we were, but we are both still here. Still trying, still carrying Gerald between us the way people carry someone they've lost, not like a weight, but like a compass. I believe in second chances. Not because people deserve them automatically, but because grace is rarely earned and still sometimes given. I got mine. I'm grateful for every day of it. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done? Would you have signed those papers before you knew the truth? Would you have forgiven your child? There is no wrong answer. I'm genuinely asking. If you'd like to walk through more stories like this one with me, I hope you'll subscribe to Ruby Revenge. I share new stories every week. And a reminder, while this story draws from real issues surrounding financial elder abuse and estate fraud, certain elements have been dramatized for storytelling purposes. Thank you for being here. Take care of yourselves. Take care of each other.